Leprosy. It's one of humanity's most haunting and oldest diseases, and for thousands of years it's carried an almost mythical weight in cultures around the world. To the ancients, those poor sufferers of this disease seemed to undergo a living death, their bodies slowly disfiguring and rotting away, while they lived in isolation from society. It was feared as a curse of the gods, a punishment for sin, a hereditary taint, anything but an ordinary illness. Yet, we are a long way from the ancient times, and attitudes changed, from medieval times to Victorian period to now. Over the millennia, our understanding of this disease has evolved dramatically, from those earliest mentions in the ancient texts and the skeletal remains that we found through archaeology, to the medieval rituals of exclusion, and that scientific breakthrough of identifying its bacterial cause in the 19th century. We're finally able to understand effective cures and treatment in the modern era. And so today, we are going to talk about the history of leprosy. We're going to talk about how each era viewed and dealt with the disease, and also about its stigma and the cultural impact that it had. It's a story spanning ancient civilizations all the way up to our year 2025. And let's do our best to approach it with the most amount of respect possible. Now, before we get into all this, I would like to welcome you to the channel. As is customary, I'd like to say hello to any newcomers, and if you feel inclined to, hit that subscribe button. And thank you to anyone coming back. This video and everything else on this channel is ad-free, and that is due to the generous contributions of those on the Patreon, YouTube members, those who checked out the merch store, and the occasional donation through either YouTube or PayPal. You have my thanks, those supporters, and I will read a list of them at the end of the video. And if you want to become part of that prestigious club, well, all of the links that you need to find are in the video description, the channel description, or the pinned comment. Now, with all that being said, let's get on to the topic of today: leprosy. So if we want to speak about leprosy, we have to go way, way back. It begins in deep antiquity. But that being said, the exact origins of the disease are still pretty mysterious. But archaeological evidence suggests that it has afflicted humans for at least 4,000 years. Well, for example, in India, they uncovered a 4,000-year-old skeleton with bone damage characteristic of leprosy, the oldest physical evidence of the disease, at least for now. Who knows what we're going to find later on. Likewise, DNA from ancient burials indicates leprosy was present in ancient Egypt and the Near East. By the first millennium BCE, leprosy was clearly recognized in great civilizations of Asia and the Mediterranean. However, ancient people didn't call it leprosy. That term would come around a little bit later. They described it with their own words, and often confused it with other ailments due to limited medical knowledge. Can't really blame them for that. Early written records hint at leprosy's presence too. The Old Testament of the Bible contains notorious passages about a condition called tzara-ath, long translated as leprosy. Now we find in Leviticus 13-14, sufferers are described as having skin spots and are declared unclean. They have to live apart from the city, and whenever they approach, they have to cry out, "Unclean, unclean," to warn others of their approach. And we have to note, however, that the Hebrew tzara-ath likely lumped together many skin diseases. Even mildew on walls was often called the same name, by the way. The term was more about ritual impurity than a specific clinical diagnosis. But still, these biblical laws established a lasting image of leprosy as a divinely cursed affliction, and one that required banishment from the community. Similar ideas appear in other ancient Near Eastern texts. In the Persian Empire, according to the Greek historian Herodotus, 5th century BCE, lepers were shunned because the Persians believed the illness was a punishment from the sun god, so much that the native Persians with leprosy were forced to live outside of society. And as for foreign lepers, well, they were deported entirely. Go somewhere else and be a leper. Well, such accounts reveal that by 500 BCE, at least 500 BCE that is, people in the Middle East recognized a chronic, disfiguring disease, and they responded with exclusion and fear. Well, let's go a little bit east, to the Indian subcontinent, and there were also ancient descriptions of what was probably leprosy. The Vedas, that is, sacred Sanskrit texts, perhaps composed well before 1000 BCE, mention a disease called kushtha, meaning eating away. Doesn't sound good, doesn't it? Well, many scholars believe that it referred to leprosy, or at least a group of skin diseases that included it. By the early century CE, Indian medical compendiums gave more clarity. They described kushtha symptoms consistent with leprosy, that is, such a loss of sensation in patches of skin, things like that. And they even tried to prescribe some treatments. Now, remarkably, one remedy was the oil from the seeds of the chalmugra tree, an ancient Ayurvedic treatment that, though only partially effective, would re-emerge centuries later as a key to the first modern cure. Now, this shows that Indian physicians had identified the disease and experimented with therapies long before Western science had. Meanwhile, even further east in China, the earliest likely reference to leprosy comes from the Warring States period. Now, if you're not familiar with the Chinese chronology, that's about the 4th to 3rd century BCE. The medical text called The Models for Sealing and Investigating around 300 BCE uses the term li for a chronic skin disorder and gives a description close to leprosy. It notes symptoms like the destruction of the nasal septum, loss of sensation, changes in voice. And this is quite significant. The collapse of the nose's cartilage is a classic sign of advanced leprosy. Yet outside China, such a detail wasn't recorded until over a millennium later. Now, why is this? Perhaps it's because when leprosy was advanced, well, those lepers were already banished to the colonies outside. It wouldn't get to the point where they would see advanced lepers around people who would record these details. Maybe. That's just my opinion. In any case, and in subsequent centuries, China and other East Asian writings continued to discuss Li or Da Fan disease, often with an understanding that it was chronic or at least very hard to cure. Similarly, ancient Buddhist texts from Sri Lanka told legends of princes afflicted with leprosy who went into exile and found cures through herbal medicine, showing knowledge of the disease in Southeast Buddhist culture too. Now back to the Greco-Roman world. They became acquainted with leprosy a little bit later, likely through contact with the East. Classical Greek physicians initially had a different concept. The Greek word lepra originally meant any scaly skin condition, so think of things like psoriasis or perhaps skin peeling after a sunburn, this kind of thing. Now, what we call leprosy today was probably rare in Greece before the conquest of Alexander the Great. After Alexander's armies marched through Egypt and into India in the 4th century BCE, references to new disfiguring diseases start to appear. Greek writers and later the Romans often called it elephantiasis, not to be confused with the modern filarial disease. The term evoked thick, rough skin like an elephant's hide, hence the name. Roman authors like Aulus Cornelius Celsus and Pliny the Elder in the 1st century CE described this elephantiasis as a foreign disease. Celsus thought it came from Egypt. Others blamed Asia Minor. Either way, it was seen as an outside affliction, and these accounts likely refer to leprosy, by then making inroads into the Mediterranean world. The Romans observed the telltale features: patches of insensible skin, nodules on the face and ears, and progressive mutilations of extremities. However, because medicine was still quite primitive, they couldn't be sure what caused it. Some thought it was due to unhealthy diet, some blamed the climate, but no one really knew for sure. It was all speculation at this point. In any case, by the end of Antiquity, around the 5th century CE, leprosy had established a foothold from China and India to the heart of Europe. So how do we summarize the ancient period leprosy? Well, we can say that leprosy originated earlier than recorded history. Genetic studies today suggest it may have first arisen in either East Africa or South Asia, and then spread along human migration and trade routes. It was certainly recognized as a distinct affliction in various ancient cultures, though often confused with other diseases or lumped in a big umbrella term. But most importantly, ancient societies had one thing in common: they uniformly regarded leprosy with superstition and existential dread. With no cure and a frightening course of physical deterioration, it's no wonder that leprosy was often seen as a disease that, quote, eats the body and soul. Of course, the ancient world just sets the foundation, the stage for how medieval people would treat victims of leprosy, often with that same fear, exclusion, and moral judgment, although tempered at times by charity and religious duty. So let's talk about leprosy in the medieval world now. So during the medieval era, that is, roughly 5th to the 15th century CE, leprosy became quite common across Europe, Middle East, and parts of Asia. Tragically common. But this period is often what people imagine when they think of leprosy. Those forlorn creatures cloaked in rags, banished to the edges of towns, ringing that bell to warn others as their approach. It's really quite sad. But it is a little bit exaggerated. Well, it's kind of the truth, but somewhat exaggerated. Medieval society's response to leprosy was shaped by both long-standing fear and the moral framework of Christianity, and in other regions, of course, Islam and Buddhism. We'll get to them. In the early Middle Ages, that is 500 to 1000, leprosy was present but not yet at its peak in Europe. The decline of the Roman Empire meant fewer written records, but we know from skeletal remains and sparse chronicles that cases did exist. Christian teachings, drawing on biblical precedents, viewed leprosy through a dual lens. You see, on one hand, it was a sign of divine punishment for impurity, which echoes the Old Testament ideas, and on the other hand, it was an opportunity for charity and saintly compassion, since Jesus was said to heal lepers in the Gospels. Now, this tension led to ambivalent treatment of leprosy sufferers. For instance, early church councils occasionally discussed leprosy. An example is the Merovingian Church Council in Orleans, France in 549, which already advised separating leprous monks from the healthy. Well, the mention of that suggests that institutional separation was indeed starting quite earlier on. And by the High Middle Ages, that is 1100 to 1300, leprosy had surged to alarming levels in Europe. But it's still debatable on why it became so widespread then. Some point to the Crusades. Soldiers and pilgrims traveling to the Middle East may have encountered leprosy and brought back new strains back home, not the kind of souvenir they were hoping for. Growing trade and urbanization could have also facilitated its spread. But whatever the cause was, medieval Europeans responded by creating a vast network of leper hospitals. These were essentially quarantine settlements for people with leprosy, usually just outside the city or town limits, and it's estimated that around the year 1200, Europe had thousands of these hospitals. A 13th century English chronicler, Matthew Paris, claimed that there were about 19,000 leper houses across Europe. Possibly an exaggeration, but it certainly gives a sense of scale. And yes, every major city and many small towns had at least one lazar house, as they were called. For example, in England, a leper house at Harbletown near Canterbury was founded as early as the 11th century, and many more popped up thereafter. In the Islamic world, too, dedicated wards or isolated houses for lepers were established. The earliest Islamic leprosy hospital on record was founded in Cairo in the 12th century under Sultan Saladin's rule, showing that Muslim societies also practiced compassionate isolation. But life in a medieval leper colony was a mix of refuge and prison. On one hand, these houses offered shelter, food, and care, often run by religious orders as an act of charity. Lepers were not simply thrown to the wilderness. Many communities and churches felt quite a duty to provide and care for them. The love of God, this kind of thing. But on the other hand, the entry into a leprosarium usually meant a permanent separation from normal society. A newly diagnosed person might undergo a ritual akin to a funeral. Medieval records describe how a priest would perform a mass of separation for the leper. The individual stood in the church doorway while the ceremony declared them dead to the world. They had to don a special garment, often a coarse robe, sometimes a bell or wooden clapper to announce themselves, and were therefore, and thereafter rather, considered legally and socially dead. One chronicler described the person as, quote, separated from the communion of the living, but not from the mercy of God. Probably cold comfort for the time, I suppose. The leper was then taken to live in the leper community, dependent on charity or a small endowment for survival. Well, inside the leprosarium, a strict code often applied. In some places, residents took monastic-style vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They were typically expected to stay within the colony's limits. Leaving without permission, well, that could be punishable. Many leper houses had their own chapel, so leprous individuals could worship separately. Yet despite these harsh separations, medieval lepers formed their own communities. They referred to each other as brother or sister, and there is evidence that some leper houses were not utterly miserable. With support, many patients lived for years or decades, and basic needs were generally met. A famous medieval quote from a bishop instructs, "Do not refuse to sustain those who have died to the world and live only for God," emphasizing care for lepers as a Christian duty. Medieval imagery and literature reinforced the idea of the leper as both pitiful and menacing. Art from the time often depicted lepers with clanging bells and ulcerated skin, sometimes even portraying them as demonic figures, which is a little bit unfair, don't you think? Not their fault. Jeez. Well, an engraving from the 15th century shows a leper beggar drawn as a devil, reflecting the fear and moral stigma attached to these poor people. Popular legends and romances use leprosy as a plot element too. For example, in the legend of Tristan and Isolde, King Mark contemplates punishing Queen Isolde for adultery by handing her over to a band of lepers, a fate considered worse than death, of course, as the lepers themselves gleefully promise to keep her alive in endless degradation. Well, such stories show how lepers were imagined as dangerous and vengeful outcasts, who might inflict cruelty and revenge upon the world that cast them aside if given the chance, which further justified society's fear. Well, speaking of fear, it sometimes boiled over into outright persecution. A notorious incident was the 1321 Lepers' Plot. In that year, there were rumors sweeping southern France that leprosy sufferers, perhaps in league with Jews and Muslims, were conspiring to poison the wells and springs to infect the healthy population. Of course, this only snowballed out of control and led to violence. Lepers were arrested en masse. Many were executed, burned at the stake, and repressive measures against those who survived were tightened. A disturbing episode of scapegoating, similar to how witches or Jews were blamed for calamities in other times. The 1321 panic reveals the extreme stigma leprosy carried, that's for sure. They were seen as not just sick, but as an existential threat to society. Though it is worth noting that such extreme persecution was not the norm, was quite the exception. But the fact that it did occur at all is something that we have to mention. It's quite telling of the era's fear. Things that people don't understand. They always get scared of that. Well, alongside the fear and cruelty, the Middle Ages also saw remarkable compassion towards lepers. The same period that produced the leper mass and the leper's plot also produced saints who embraced lepers. The most famous is St. Francis of Assisi, 1181 to 1226. In his youth, Francis felt repulsed by lepers. Well, as did everyone else. Nothing special there. But in a pivotal moment of spiritual crisis, he encountered a leper on the road. Overcoming his horror, Francis gave the man alms and a kiss of peace. He later described that act of mercy as the moment his life changed. Quote, "What had seemed bitter to me was turned into sweetness of soul and body." After that, Francis often ministered to lepers, seeing Christ in their suffering, somehow. His example influenced others in his new Franciscan order to care for leprosy patients with love and charity. And similarly, other religious figures such as St. Damien of Molokai, though he is 19th century, was later canonized, and historically earlier St. Basil, the 4th century, who reportedly founded a charity house for lepers in Cappadocia, reflected this Christian ideal of charity over fear. Institutionally, the Church even created an order of knighthood dedicated to leprosy. During the Crusades, a hospital for lepers in Jerusalem grew into the Order of St. Lazarus. This military religious order, established in the 12th century, took as its mission the care of those suffering from leprosy, and also included knights who themselves were afflicted, an astonishing reversal of norms. Some members, known as leper knights, were both warriors and patients, depending on how they felt on the day, I'm sure. The Order of St. Lazarus allowed leprous knights to continue a life of purpose. They were often crusaders who caught the disease in the Levant, fighting or managing hospitals, rather than being completely cast out of society. The very Grand Master of the Order, who was traditionally required to be a leper. Although, over time, the military role faded, the Order maintained hospitals across Europe for centuries. This unique institution shows that medieval society's attitude to leprosy wasn't all the same. It wasn't this monolithic negativity. It could also inspire organized compassion. And I like that term, organized compassion. Well, since we are in the Near East, we may as well talk about the Islamic world. Well, attitudes there paralleled those in Europe in quite a few ways. Classical Islamic physicians preserved and built upon the Greco-Roman medical knowledge. Ibn Sina, the great Persian polymath, included leprosy in his canon of medicine in 1025. Now he's also called Avicenna in the Greek rendering, I believe. I believe it's a Greek rendering. In any case, he gave one of the era's clearest clinical descriptions. He noted skin lesions, loss of sensation, muscle weakness, and even suggesting contagion as a factor. He wrote about the disease being specifically contagious, while entertaining inherited susceptibility. Islamic teachings encourage humane treatment. The Prophet Muhammad is traditionally said to have urged kindness to the sick, including lepers, although there are also hadiths cautioning people to keep a distance from leprosy, as one would from a lion. In practice, medieval Muslim rulers often established hospitals that had sections for chronic diseases like leprosy. Notably, these hospitals did not expel patients once admitted, and in some cases, lepers could live comfortably with provided stipends. The city of Damascus, for example, had a well-known leprosy asylum as early as the 13th century where patients received regular food and baths. Thus, in both Christian and Muslim lands, by the late medieval period, the isolation of lepers became a formal part of public health and charity. Leprosy was, in a sense, the first disease to inspire proto-sanitary legislation and institutional care on a large scale. But by the late Middle Ages, something interesting began to happen in Europe. The cases of leprosy began to dwindle. Around the 14th to 15th centuries, contemporaries noticed that the dreadful disease was not as prevalent as before. Leprosaria gradually emptied out. Some were converted to other uses. For example, many became shelters for the poor or hospitals for other ailments. By 1500, leprosy had largely vanished from many parts of Western Europe, though pockets remained in places like Norway, Spain, and Eastern Europe for a few more centuries, but we'll get to that. Now, there are several theories for this decline. One theory credits improved living conditions. Better nutrition and hygiene may have bolstered general immunity among Europeans, helping them resist leprosy. Another intriguing theory involves tuberculosis. The germ that causes TB is related to the leprosy bacillus, and it's thought that as TB spread in Europe, it conferred a sort of cross-immunity against leprosy. Which one would you rather have, tuberculosis or leprosy? It's a rock and a hard place, isn't it? But there's also a grim possibility, and that's that the Black Death of the 14th century simply killed a large portion of the susceptible population, indirectly reducing leprosy's spread. By the 17th century, leprosy had become a rarity in most of Europe, remembered as largely a medieval horror of the past. But the world is much bigger than Europe now, isn't it? And the story was quite different globally. Even as Europe's leper houses closed, leprosy persisted in other regions. In part of the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, the disease remained endemic. Travelers and colonists from Europe in the 16th to 18th centuries occasionally wrote about encountering leprosy in distant lands, sometimes with the same fear and disgust as their medieval ancestors did. And so, that's the segue, which leads us to the early modern and colonial era. And this is when leprosy truly became a global story. European expansion would spread the disease to new areas and sometimes re-import it to Europe. And Western observers, well, they would study it with fresh eyes and a bit of fresh scientific perspective. So from the 16th through to the 18th century, leprosy kind of receded from the European consciousness, at least to some extent, but it certainly did not disappear from the world. In fact, this period saw leprosy pop up in regions where it had never been recorded before, likely as a result of increased travel, trade, and, well, also those horrifying migrations of the slave trade as well. And during the age of exploration and colonial expansion, Europeans encountered leprosy in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Sometimes they were re-encountering a disease they knew from history, and sometimes they mistakenly thought it was a new sickness, unique to those lands they encountered. But there is one historical question, and that's whether leprosy existed in the Americas prior to European contact. It's an interesting thing to ponder. You see, for a long time, conventional wisdom was that leprosy did not exist in the pre-Columbian Americas, that it was introduced by European colonizers or African slaves, and the reasoning behind that was that Native American populations had no known word for it, and early Spanish chroniclers didn't clearly identify it among the indigenous peoples. I mean, it's kinda hard to miss, right? And indeed, as the Atlantic slave trade tragically brought millions of Africans to the New World, some of those enslaved people did carry leprosy, which was present in parts of West Africa, where the African slave markets were centered. Well, they brought this back to the Caribbean and Americas in the 17th and 18th centuries, and, well, the rest just snowballs out of control, doesn't it? Leprosy began to be reported in Spanish colonies, Brazil, and the southern United States. For example, by the 18th century, there were leprosaria hospitals established in places like Colombia and Cuba for leprosy patients, many of whom were of African descent. European plantation owners, unfamiliar and fearful, segregated those afflicted. However, recent scientific findings as of 2025 have shaken the old assumptions. We're talking really recent here. Genetic analysis of ancient skeletons in the America has revealed that a form of leprosy was present among the indigenous people at least 1,000 years ago. And I don't know how good your mathematics is, but that is well before Columbus. It's a surprising discovery, and it suggests that leprosy may have reached the Americas via early human migrations or other unknown means. But still, it was after European contact that leprosy became widely noted in the New World written record. So yeah, there's that. But in Europe, as noted, leprosy had waned to quite a dramatic extent, and everyone was quite happy for that news. By 1700, if a European doctor saw a case, it was a rarity worth noting about, often termed lepra or elephantiasis in medical texts, but considered quite exotic. For instance, Norway and Sweden still had some cases in rural areas, and these drew interest from physicians later. Yeah, we'll get back to Norway soon, actually. But there is a curious footnote too, and that's even after leprosy ceased to be a major threat. The word leper remained in the European lexicon as a metaphor for an outcast, or even in some cases a morally tainted person. The imagery had so permeated culture that it stuck around to stigmatize long after the actual disease mostly left. Meanwhile, in Asia and Africa, leprosy continued into modern times much as it had in the past. In India, for example, the disease was widespread in the 18th and 19th centuries. Under British colonial rule, officials grew concerned about leprosy in the local population. Missionaries in India often encountered many cases, and sometimes even founded asylums for lepers, seeing it as both a charitable mission but also a way to, well, contain the disease, fingers crossed. In fact, in 1870, the British doctor Frederick Moat reintroduced the ancient Indian remedy of shalmugra oil to Western medicine after learning of its use locally. Colonial authorities eventually passed the Lepers Act of 1898 in British India, which provided for the segregation and incarceration of pauper leprosy patients in asylums. But of course, in practice it wasn't fully enforced everywhere, but it does show the thinking of the time. Isolation, that is the primary tool against the lepers. In other colonies like those in Africa, similar patterns occurred. For example, in the Dutch East Indies, that is, Indonesia, and in various African colonies, leprosy settlements were established in the 19th century. It's important to mention that well into the 1800s, too, no one actually knew what caused leprosy. A few people thought they knew, but they were a little bit off the mark. The prevailing theories oscillated between hereditary origin and contagion. Some believed it ran in certain families, or even in certain races. Others thought it was spread by contact, but were quite puzzled by its low contagiousness. Unlike plague or smallpox, leprosy typically affected only a small fraction of those exposed, and it progressed quite slowly. This uncertainty, meant that policies were inconsistent. Some places enforced strict quarantine. Others allowed patients to live in villages, while just discouraging close contact. Don't go to the guy with leprosy's house. In any case, by the late 18th century, a few European physicians had begun to take systematic interest in leprosy as a scientific question. One notable development came from the Caribbean. In 1755, the Spanish doctor José de Bustamante in Caracas wrote an important treatise on leprosy, describing it in detail and noting how he believed it was actually quite contagious. And on the other side of the world, in 19th century Hawaii, American and Hawaiian doctors confronted a sudden epidemic of leprosy in the native population, likely introduced around the 1830s, possibly foreign sailors or workers from China or elsewhere. The disease spread rapidly among Hawaiians with devastating effect, and by the 1860s, the Kingdom of Hawaii's government instituted one of the most infamous leprosy isolation policies, the establishment of a leper colony on the remote island of Molokai. Now, the Molokai leper colony was founded in 1866. Patients in Hawaii were diagnosed, often just on pure appearance, were forcibly taken from their families and shipped off to this rugged peninsula, essentially left there to survive on their own, just away from the eyes of polite society. Now, in the early years, the conditions on Molokai were horrific, to say the least. An eyewitness account from the 1870s described the scene. Hundreds of ill people with ulcerating sores and deformities, living in ramshackle huts with scant food or clean water. Little law, little order, and a sense of abandonment that bred despair. One visitor wrote, "Physical decay was accompanied by mental and moral decay," noting the colony was plagued by filth, alcoholism, violence, and hopelessness. This was leprosy's human toll laid bare. Not only the disease itself, but the social exile and loss of dignity that came with it when patients were left without support. It was in this desperate place that one of history's greatest humanitarians arrived. Father Damien de Vester, a Catholic priest from Belgium. He volunteered to go to Molokai in 1873 to serve the leper colony. Originally, he intended to spend only a short time providing comfort and last rites, but he ended up staying 16 years, transforming the settlement in the process. Father Damien found the colony in chaos and immediately set work to bringing order and compassion. He built churches, organized the construction of simple houses, a school and a proper hospital. He even engineered water catchment systems to provide fresh water. But beyond material improvements, he gave the residents back their dignity. In his very first sermon, addressing the crowd of outcasts, he opened with the words, "We, the lepers." In that simple phrase, he included himself among them. Well, if anything, that was to erase the social barrier. And, well, it had a profound effect. Over the years, Father Damien nursed the patients, dressed their ulcers. He even ate with them and gave them spiritual hope. Now, inevitably, he contracted leprosy himself, likely to years of close contact and perhaps tending to wounds without protection. But he continued the work, even as the disease began to disfigure him, until his death, finally in 1889. It was a self-sacrifice that made him world-famous. He became known as the Apostle of the Lepers, and ultimately he was canonized as a saint in 2009. His story is quite a counterpoint to the fear and stigma, don't you think? It shows the possibility of empathy overcoming fear. But also it illustrates how dire the conditions were that such heroism was needed in the first place, just to restore basic human dignity. There were others who followed in Damien's footsteps too. For instance, Sister, now Saint Marianne Cope of Syracuse. She led a group of nuns to Molokai to help after Damien. And Kate Marsden, a British nurse, who undertook a perilous journey across Siberia in the 1890s to find and aid leprosy patients in remote Yakutia, even seeking a legendary herb cure. But these individuals founded leprosariums and improved conditions for the afflicted in far-flung regions, and that shows a growing international humanitarian concern. Well, by the end of the 19th century, even as charity workers toiled in colonies and remote areas, scientists were closing in on leprosy's deepest secret, the cause. And, well, the stage was set for the breakthrough that the world could connect leprosy's ancient saga with a modern bacteriology, changing the approach from mere isolation to maybe even hopes of a cure. It was the year 1873 that was the pivotal moment in the history of leprosy. In that very year, the Norwegian physician Dr. Gerhard Amer Hansen peered through the microscope in Bergen and saw something that no one had seen before. Tiny, little rod-shaped organisms in a sample of leprous tissue. He had discovered Microbacterium leprae, the bacterium that causes leprosy. Historic milestone indeed. It was the first time a bacterium was identified as the cause of a human disease. This occurred just a few years before Robert Koch's famous discovery of tuberculosis bacillus, and at that time when germ theory was only just beginning to gain traction and acceptance. Hansen's road to discovery, however, was not easy, to say the least. Leprosy was still prevalent in coastal Norway in the 19th century. They had thousands of cases, one of the highest rates in Europe at the time. Working at a leprosy hospital, St. Jürgen's Hospital in Bergen, by the way, Hansen was determined to prove that leprosy was caused by a microbe, and not simply hereditary as many believed. After staining tissue samples with special dyes, he finally observed the minute bacteria clustered in patients' lesions. He announced his finding in 1873. However, proving that these bacteria caused the disease required going further, ideally infecting a healthy subject with them, since Koch postulates for establishing causation were not yet formalized but implicitly sought by scientists. Hansen's attempts to solidify his discovery got him into a little bit of trouble. Now, because the bacteria cannot be easily grown in a lab, he tried to demonstrate its infectiousness through animal and human experiments. He attempted to inoculate rabbits and other animals with leprosy. but they did not develop the disease. So, in frustrating fashion, he in 1879 took the drastic and rather unethical step of inoculating a sample of leprosy bacteria into the eye of a female patient, without her consent, by the way. Yeah, there was no point in asking for consent on that one. Of course, he was doing this to see if it would produce symptoms. Now, as for the patient, understandably suspicious of the procedure, later sued Dr. Hansen, and a Norwegian court actually ruled in her favor, too, and Hansen was censored and stripped of his clinical post for performing an experiment on a patient without consent. Now, this case is often cited as one of the first legal precedents for uninformed consent in medical research. But despite the setback, Hansen's scientific legacy was secure. By the early 1880s, other researchers confirmed the presence of the bacteria in tissues, and his discovery was hailed worldwide, kind of overshadowing the human experimentation, everyone conveniently forgetting about that. Well, the germ was now referred to as Hansen's bacillus, and eventually leprosy itself would be officially named Hansen's disease, and that is a term that is still used, by the way, particularly to avoid the stigma of the word leprosy. And so, with the bacterium identified, the late 19th century saw a shift in thinking. Leprosy was conclusively an infection, not a curse or a purely hereditary ailment. This vindicated those who had long suspected contagion. Ironically, proving leprosy infections led many governments to double down on strict isolation policies. For instance, Norway, after Hansen's work, passed an 1885 law requiring compulsory isolation of leprosy patients, either at home or in hospitals, but with quite a lot of precautions, though most of the hospitals would not really want to take on that responsibility, and in practice the wealthy could quarantine at home, but poorer patients were forced into institutions, effectively a life sentence. Other countries followed suit. Japan, influenced both by its own fears and Western science, which it was just getting a hold of at the time, enacted laws to segregate all leprosy patients in sanatoria. Eventually, the 1907 and more sweeping Leprosy Prevention Law of 1931. As for the British colonies, they had already begun confinement policies, which intensified under the new research. Thus, by 1900, the dominant approach to leprosy worldwide was segregate and isolate. In the United States, for an example, a national leprosarium was established in Carville, Louisiana in 1894, and patients from all over the U.S., sometimes from overseas territories, were sent to Carville. Many of them lived out their entire lives there, separated from their families. And interestingly, Carville developed its own patient culture. They had a baseball team. They published a newsletter too, and some even married, though they were not allowed to have children on the site. That being said, try stopping people from doing that. But they often used aliases to spare their relatives the shame, which shows the stigma that did persist. A diagnosis of leprosy still meant social death. While isolation may have helped reduce transmission somewhat, it was far from a complete solution, especially with so many hidden cases, and the long incubation period of the disease, which was 5 years on average, sometimes 10 or more. Who knows? You might have it right now. That's a scary thought, isn't it? Well, what was really needed, just like any other disease, was a cure. And it's here where we have a hopeful turn in the early 20th century. Researchers dusted off that old ancient remedy, chalmugra oil. This thick oil from tropical seeds has an anecdotal success rate in India, China, and Burma for centuries. Western doctors in the 19th century tried giving chalmugra oil by mouth to leprosy patients, but it did not taste very nice and caused everyone to vomit. Rubbing it on the skin had very little effect. The real breakthrough came from a young chemist known as Alice Ball. In 1915 to 16, Alice Ball, an African-American researcher at the College of Hawaii, which is now the University of Hawaii, by the way, developed a method to modify chalmugra oil into a form that could be injected. The Ball method, as it came to be known, involved saponifying the oil to make it water-soluble. But unfortunately, Miss Ball died at the age of 24 before she could see the full impact of her work. But her innovation allowed doctors to inject leprosy patients with chalmugra oil derivatives that actually stayed in the body and fought the disease. The results were quite promising. Over the late 1910s and 20s, dozens of patients at Kalihi Hospital in Hawaii and later Carville and elsewhere were treated with chalmugra injections. Many showed dramatic improvement. Lesions healed, sensation returned, and ultimately the disease went into remission. By 1920, as a direct result of Ball's injectable oil, around 28 formerly segregated patients in Hawaii were declared leprosy-free and allowed to leave the leprosarium and go back to normal life. It was essentially the first effective treatment for leprosy in history. Well, it wasn't perfect, by the way. Injections were painful and had to be given over months or years, and not everyone responded. But it was something. It was a ray of hope. It's either that or spend the rest of your life in the leper colony. Ugh. Well, throughout the 20s and 30s, chalmugra oil and improved compounds from it remained the standard therapy. People started to speak of cures, and a few leprosaria even closed, as there wasn't enough lepers to really justify keeping them open. Some skepticism did remain in the medical community about what constituted a full cure, since the bacteria were hard to eradicate completely. But patient outcomes definitely did improve, and no one could really argue with that. As the 20th century progressed, so did medical science. In the 1940s, well, that was the next leap, the era of antibiotics. The first specifically synthesized drug for leprosy was promin, a sulfone compound introduced in the early 1940s. Promin had to be given by intravenous injection, but it produced striking improvements, and much faster than chalmugra. This was quickly followed by a pill form called dapsone, which has a very long medical name that I won't attempt to pronounce. Actually, I will. Let's see if I can do it. Diaminodiphenylsulfone. Diaminodiphenylsulfone. I think that's it. In any case, by the late 1940s, dapsone became the wonder drug for leprosy. Taken as a tablet, it could halt the progression of the disease and gradually kill the bacteria. So for the first time, doctors had a relatively easy to administer and pretty effective medication. Patients no longer necessarily needed to be kept in lifelong isolation. If treated early, they could avoid the severe disability entirely. Very lucky. However, as more patients were treated with single drugs like dapsone, a new challenge emerged. The leprosy bacillus slowly developed resistance to the medication when used alone. Uh-oh, that's not good. By the 1960s, cases of dapsone-resistant leprosy were appearing, threatening to undermine the gains. So what was the solution? Well, they had to wait until the 80s for that. It was multi-drug therapy, a combination of drugs to prevent the bacteria from outsmarting the treatment. The World Health Organization recommended a regimen of dapsone, rifampicin, and clofazimine in 1981. Now this would cure leprosy in as little as 6 to 12 months of daily treatment, and the multi-drug therapy was certainly a game changer. It not only treated the disease, but rendered patients non-infectious after the first doses, meaning they no longer had to be isolated while undergoing the treatment. Over the next decades, MDT, multi-drug therapy, was rolled out globally, often provided free of charge by governments and NGOs. And the results? Pretty damn good. The worldwide prevalence of leprosy plummeted from millions of cases in the early 1980s to a few 100,000 by the 2000s. And by the year 2000, the WHO declared leprosy eliminated as a public health problem, at least in most countries. Well, that is defined as less than one case per 10,000 people, though pockets of it still remained. Now, although effective treatment exists, the legacy of leprosy's long and troubled history is not so easily erased. One of the biggest challenges, even today, is the stigma attached to the disease. And that doesn't just go for leprosy, it goes for a lot of different diseases. Our societies have feared leprosy for centuries, and many of those old attitudes still linger on. We're probably guilty of it ourselves, to be honest. In some communities in South Asia, Africa, or Latin America, people diagnosed with leprosy still face ostracism. Family members might shun them. You might get fired from your job. Marriage prospects evaporate. No one really wants to get married to a leper now, don't they? Well, much of this is due to the lack of awareness that leprosy is now curable and only mildly contagious with prolonged contact, and that's if you're not taking the medicine. Health workers often have to fight not just the disease, but the rumors and the fear surrounding it. And this is where, well, all diseases get. It's a difficult thing because people don't want to go to the doctor because they fear that, well, maybe it'll just go away on its own. It has to, because if I go to the doctor and if I get diagnosed with this disease, all my friends and family are going to think that I'm just disgusting. If you have any problems, just go to the doctor. People are even afraid they're going to get judged by the doctor, even in this day and age. But I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. In any case, I hope no one is suffering with leprosy out there. And it is sobering to realize that even in the 20th century, after the age of antibiotics, some governments continued draconian segregation policies. Now, you might be thinking of some African country or perhaps some place in the third world, but no. The most poignant example is Japan. You see, Japan had a long-standing law, first passed in 1907 and then strengthened in 1931, mandating that all persons with leprosy be confined to special leprosariums, often in remote areas or on an island somewhere. And the law stayed in effect for decades, fueled by an exaggerated fear of contagion or eugenic ideas. The law even enforced abortions or sterilizations on patients to prevent them from having children. Now that is pretty monstrous for the 20th century. Even after effective drug therapy was available, Japan did not rescind compulsory isolation. Parents who were cured with multi-drug therapy in the 1980s were still not allowed to leave the sanatoria. And it wasn't until 1996 that Japan finally abolished its leprosy prevention law and acknowledged the policy that had been a grave injustice. Many former patients and their families later sued the governments for compensation, and quite rightly so, get the bag, citing psychological and social harm caused by those lost, wasted years. And in 2001, the Japanese courts ruled in their favor, and the government issued an apology, and hopefully a big wad of cash as well. while other countries had similar issues. In some places, old leper colonies turned into lifetime refuge communities for survivors who had nowhere else to go, or they simply remained by choice. For example, the inhabitants of Carville, Louisiana, once treatment was possible and the isolation policy relaxed, were technically free to leave by the late 20th century, but many had lived there so long, estranged from the outside world, that Carville had become more of a home than their old home had. It transformed over time into more of a long-term care facility than a prison. Not today, Carville is closed as a leprosarium. It's a museum and training center now, by the way. And patients in the US are treated as outpatients like anyone else with any other infectious disease. Globally, as of the 21st century, our year 2025, when I'm recording this video, leprosy remains endemic in a few regions. About 200,000 cases are reported each year, mostly in countries like India, which accounts for over half of all cases. Brazil, Indonesia, and several African nations, they have their numbers pretty high too. The good news among all this is that virtually all of these cases can be cured with multi-drug therapy. The focus of organizations like the World Health Organization and the Leprosy Mission is now on early detection, finding cases before nerve damage and disability set in, and on combating stigma too, so that patients can come forward for treatment without being shy to do so, as I mentioned. Public health campaigns also emphasize that leprosy is not highly contagious. In fact, and here's something that makes you feel a little bit more comfortable, 95% of humans actually have a natural immunity to it. Just hope you're not the 5%. And that after a few doses of medicine, a patient cannot spread the disease at all. It effectively cuts the bacteria off at the knees. Well, education, efforts, and community outreach are gradually changing attitudes. But there's still plenty of misconceptions persisting in some places. For instance, a false belief that leprosy might be a curse or that it isn't curable. Things like that. In fact, it wouldn't surprise me that many people, even listening to this video, would think that it's an incurable, debilitating disease. It's no fault of their own, that's how it's been presented to everyone. Every little bit of media that we've got just presents leprosy as this horrible thing. So yeah. In any case, that is it from me today. I would like to thank you all for coming along. And I would like to thank my top-tier patrons and supporters. Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Carrie, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfinir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuronerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Talvery, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftis, Alexander, Gokan, Dorsey, Venita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, Brittany, David, and Cody. Thank you so much. Okay, well, that is it for everyone. I remind you all to please wash your hands, and I will see you in the next video. Lots of love to you all, and good night.